Part 1 of Chapter 4 of The Logic of Hegel by Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel. Translated by William Wallace. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Ryan Smallwood. Second attitude of thought to objectivity. 1. Empiricism. Under these circumstances, a double want began to be felt. Partly it was the need of a concrete subject matter, as a counterpoise to the abstract theories of understanding, which is unable to advance, unaided from its generalities, to specialization and determination. Partly, too, it was the demand for something fixed and secure, so as to exclude the possibility of proving anything and everything in the sphere, and according to the method of the finite formulae of thought. Such was the genesis of empirical philosophy, which abandons the search for truth in thought itself and goes to fetch it from experience, the outward and the inward present. The rise of empiricism is due to the need, thus stated, of concrete contents and a firm footing, needs which abstract metaphysics of the understanding failed to satisfy. Now, by concreteness of contents, it is meant that we must know the objects of consciousness as intrinsically determinate and as the unity of distinct characteristics. But as we have already seen, this is by no means the case with the metaphysic of understanding if it conform to its principle. With the mere understanding, thinking is limited to the form of an abstract universal, and can never advance to the particularization of this universal. Thus, we find the metaphysicians engaged in an attempt to elicit by the instrumentality of thought what was the essence of fundamental attribute of the soul. The soul, they say, is simple. The simplicity thus ascribed to the soul meant a mere and utter simplicity from which difference is excluded. Difference, or in other words composition, being made the fundamental attribute of body or matter in general. Clearly, in simplicity of this narrow type, we have a very shallow category, quite incapable of embracing the wealth of the soul or the mind. When it thus appeared that abstract metaphysical thinking was inadequate, it was felt that resource must be had to empirical psychology. The same happened in the case of rational physics. The current phrases there were, for instance, that space is infinite, that nature makes no leap, etc. Evidently this phraseology was wholly unsatisfactory in presence of the plenitude and life of nature. To some extent this source from which empiricism draws is common to it with metaphysic. It is in our materialized conceptions, i.e. in facts which emanate in the first instance from experience, that metaphysic also finds the guarantee for the correctness of its definitions, including both its initial assumptions and its more detailed body of doctrine. But on the other hand, it must be noted that the single sensation is not the same thing as experience, and that the empirical school elevates the facts included under sensation, feeling, and perception into the form of general ideas, propositions, or laws. This, however, it does with the reservation that these general principles, such as force, are to have no further import or validity of their own beyond that taken from the sense impression, and that no connection will be deemed legitimate except what can be shown to exist in phenomena. Now, on the subjective side, empirical cognition has its stable footing in the fact that, in a sensation, consciousness is directly present and certain of itself. In empiricism lies the great principle that whatever is true must be in the actual world and present to sensation. This principle contradicts that ought to be, on the strength of which reflection is vain enough to treat the actual present with scorn and to point to a scene beyond, a scene which is assumed to have place and being only in the understanding of those who talk of it. No less than empiricism, philosophy recognizes only what it is, and has nothing to do with what merely ought to be and what is thus confessed not to exist. On the subjective side too, it is right to notice the valuable principle of freedom involved in empiricism. For the main lesson of empiricism is that man must see for himself and feel that he is present in every fact of knowledge which he has to accept. When it is carried out to its legitimate consequences, empiricism, being in its fact limited to the finite sphere, denies the supersensible in general, or at least any knowledge of it which would define its nature. It leaves thought no powers except abstraction and formal universality and identity. But there is a fundamental delusion in all scientific empiricism. It employs the metaphysical categories of matter, force, those of one, many, generality, infinity, etc. Following the clue given by these categories, it proceeds to draw conclusions, and in doing so, presupposes and applies the syllogistic form. And while it is unaware that it contains metaphysics, in wielding which it makes use of those categories and their combinations in a style utterly thoughtless and uncritical. From empiricism came the cry, "Stop roaming in empty abstractions. Keep your eyes open. Lay hold on man and nature as they are here before you. Enjoy the present moment." Nobody can deny that there is a good deal of truth in these words. The everyday world, what is here and now, was a good exchange for the futile other world, for the mirages and the chimeras of abstract understanding. And thus was acquired an infinite principle, that solid footing so much missed in the old metaphysic. Finite principles are the most that understanding can pick out, and these being essentially unstable and tottering, the structure they supported must collapse with a crash. Always the instinct of reason was to find an infinite principle, and yet the time had not come for finding it in thought. Hence, this instinct seized upon the present, the here, the this, where doubtless there is implicit infinite form, but not in the genuine existence of that form. The external world is the truth if it could but know it, for the truth is actual and must exist. The infinite principle, the self-centered truth, therefore, is the world for reason to discover, though it exists in an individual and sensible shape, and not in its truth. Besides, this school makes sense perception the form in which fact is to be apprehended, and in this consists the defect of empiricism. Sense perception as such is always individual, always transient, not indeed that the process of knowledge stops short at sensation. On the contrary, it proceeds to find out the universal and permanent element in the individual apprehended by sense. This is the process leading from simple perception to experience. In order to form experiences, empiricism makes a special use of the form of analysis. In the impression of sense, we have a concrete of many elements, the several attributes of which we are expected to peel off one by one, like the coats of an onion. In thus dismembering the thing, it is understood that we disintegrate and take to pieces these attributes which have coalesced, and add nothing but our own act of disintegration. Yet analysis is the process from the immediacy of sensation to thought. Those attributes which the object analysed contain in union, acquire the form of universality by being separated. Empiricism, therefore, labours under a delusion, if it supposes that while analysing the objects, it leaves them as they were. It really transforms the concrete into an abstract, and as a consequence, this change of the living thing is killed. Life can exist only in the concrete and one. Not that we can do without this division if it be our intention to comprehend. Mind itself is an inherent division. The error lies in forgetting that it is only half of the process, and that the main point is the reunion of what has been parted. And it is where analysis never gets beyond the stage of partition that the words of the poet are true. In caere sin naturae nenti chemi, spaltet ihr selbst und weiß nicht wie, hat die Teile in ihrer Hand, fehlt leider nur das Gesicht der Band. Analysis starts from the concrete, and the possession of this material gives it a considerable advantage over the abstract thinking of the old metaphysics. It establishes the differences in things, and this is very important. But these very differences are nothing after all but abstract attributes, i.e. thoughts. These thoughts, it is assumed, contain the real essence of the object, and thus once more we see the axiom of bygone metaphysics reappear, that the truth of things lies in thought. Let us next compare the empirical theory with that of metaphysics in the matter of their respective contents. We find the latter, as already stated, taking for its theme the universal object of reason, viz. God, the soul, and the world. And these themes, accepted from popular conception, it was the problem of philosophy to reduce into the form of thoughts. Another specimen of the same method was the scholastic philosophy, the theme presupposed by which was formed by the dogmas of the Christian Church, and it aimed at fixing their meaning and giving them a systematic arrangement through thought. The facts on which empiricism is based are of entirely different kind. They are the sensible facts of nature and the facts of the finite mind. In other words, empiricism deals with the finite material, and the old metaphysicians had an infinite, though let us add, they made this infinite content finite by the finite form of the understanding. The same finitude of form reappears in empiricism, but here the facts are finite also. To this extent, then, both modes of philosophizing have the same method. Both proceed from data or assumptions which they accept as ultimate. Generally speaking, empiricism finds the truth in the outward world, and even if it allows a supersensible world, it holds knowledge of that world to be impossible, and would restrict us to the province of sense perception. This doctrine, when systematically carried out, produces what has been latterly named materialism. Materialism of this stamp looks upon matter qua matter as the genuine objective world, but with matter we are at once introduced to an abstraction, which as such cannot be perceived, and it may be maintained that there is no matter, because as it exists, it is always something definite and concrete. Yet the abstraction we term matter is supposed to lie in the basis of the whole world of sense, and expresses the sense world in its simplest terms as out and out individualism, and hence a congeries of points in mutual exclusion. So long then as the sensible sphere is and continues to be for empiricism a mere datum, we have a doctrine of bondage, for we become free when we are confronted by no absolutely alien world, but depend on a fact which we ourselves are. Consistently with the empirical point of view besides, reason and unreason can only be subjective. In other words, we must take what is given just as it is. We have no right to ask whether to what extent it is rational in its own nature. Touching this principle, it has been justly observed that in what we call experience, as distinct from mere single perception of single facts, there are two elements. The one is the matter, infinite in its multiplicity, and it stands a mere set of singulars. The other is the form, the characteristics of universality and necessity. Mere experience, no doubt, offers many, perhaps innumerable cases of similar perceptions. But after all, no multitude, however great, can be the same thing as universality. Similarly, mere experience affords perception of changes, succeeding each other and of objects in juxtaposition, but it presents no necessary connection. If perception, therefore, is to maintain its claim to be the sole basis of what men hold for truth, universality and the necessity appear something illegitimate. They become an accident of our mind, a mere custom, the content of which might be otherwise constituted than it is. It is an important corollary of this theory that on this empirical mode of treatment, legal and ethical principles and laws, as well as the truths of religion, are exhibited as work of chance, stripped of their objective character and inner truth. The scepticism of Hume, to which this conclusion was chiefly due, should be clearly marked off from Greek scepticism. Hume assumes the truth of the empirical element, feeling and sensation, and proceeds to challenge the universal principles and laws because they have no warranty from sense perception. So far away was ancient scepticism from making feeling and sensation the canon of truth, that it turned against the deliverances of sense first of all. 2. The critical philosophy. In common with empiricism, the critical philosophy assumes that experience affords one sole foundation for cognitions, which however it does not allow to rank as truths, but only as knowledge of phenomena. The critical theory starts originally from distinction of elements presented in the analysis of experience, viz. The matter of sense and its universal relations. Taking into account Hume's criticism on this distinction, as given in the preceding section, viz. That sensation does not explicitly apprehend more than an individual or more than a mere event, and insists at the same time on the fact that universality and necessity are seen to perform a function equally essential in constituting what is called experience. This element, not being derived from empirical facts as such, must belong to the spontaneity of thought. In other words, it is a priori. The categories or notions of the understanding constitute the objectivity of experimental cognitions. In every case they involve a connective reference, and hence through their means are formed synthetic judgments a priori, that is, primary and underivative connections of opposites. Even Hume's skepticism does not deny that characteristics of universality and necessity are found in cognition. And even in Kant this fact remains a presupposition after all. It may be said, the use of ordinary phraseology of the sciences, that Kant did no more than offer another explanation of the fact. The critical philosophy proceeds to test the value of the categories implied in metaphysic, as well as in other sciences and in ordinary conception. This scrutiny, however, is not directed to the content of these categories, nor does it inquire into the exact relation they bear to one another, but simply considers them as affected by the contrast between subjective and objective. The contrast, as we are to understand it here, bears upon the distinction of the two elements in experience. The name of objectivity is here given to the element of universality and necessity, i.e. to the categories themselves, or what is called the a priori constituent. The critical philosophy, however, widens the contrast in such a way that subjectivity comes to embrace the ensemble of experience, including both the aforementioned elements, and nothing remains the other side but the thing itself. The special forms of the a priori element, in other words of thought, which in spite of its objectivity is looked upon as a purely subjective act, present themselves as follows in a systematic order which, it may be remarked, is solely based upon psychological and historical grounds. A very important step was undoubtedly made when the terms of the old metaphysic were subjected to scrutiny. The plain thinker pursued in an unsuspecting way in those categories which had offered themselves naturally. It never occurred to him to ask to what extent these categories had a value and authority of their own. If, as has been said, it is characteristic of free thought to allow no assumptions to pass unquestioned, the old metaphysic would not free thinkers. They accepted their categories as they were without further trouble, as an a priori datum, not just tested by reflection. The critical philosophy reversed this. Kant undertook to examine how far the forms of thought were capable of leading the knowledge of truth. In particular, he demanded a criticism of the faculty of cognition as preliminary to its exercise. This is a fair demand, if it means that even the forms of thought must be made an object of investigation. Unfortunately, there soon creeps in the misconception of already knowing before you know, the error of refusing to enter the water until you should have learned to swim. True indeed, the forms of thought should be subjected to a scrutiny before they are used, yet what is this scrutiny but ipso facto a cognition? So that what we want is to combine in our process of inquiry the action of the forms of thought with a criticism of them. The forms of thought must be studied in their essential nature and complete development. They are at once the object of research and the action of that object. Hence, they examine themselves in their own action. They must determine their limits and point out their defects. This is the action of thought, which will hereafter be specially considered under the name dialectic, and regarding which we need only at the outset observe, instead of being brought to bear upon categories from without, it is immanent in their own action. We may, however, state the first point in Kant's philosophy as follows. Thought must itself investigate its own capacity of knowledge. People in the present day have to get over Kant and his philosophy. Everybody wants to get further, but there are two ways of going further, a backward and a forward. The light of criticism soon shows that many of our modern essays in philosophy are mere repetitions, and the old metaphysical method, an endless and uncritical thinking in a groove determined by the natural bent of each man's mind. Kant's examination of the categories suffers from the grave defect of viewing them, not absolutely and for their own sake, but in order to see whether they are subjective or objective. In the language of common life, we mean by objective what exists outside us and reaches us without by means of sensation. What Kant did was to deny the categories such as cause and effect, or in this sense of the word, objective or given in sensation, and to maintain on the contrary that they belong to our own thought itself, to the spontaneity of thought. To that extent, therefore, they were subjective, and yet in spite of this, Kant gives the name objective to what is thought, to the universal and necessary, while he describes as subjective whatever is merely felt. This arrangement apparently reverses the first mentioned use of the word, and has caused Kant to be charged with confusing language. But this charge is unfair if we more narrowly consider the facts of the case. The vulgar believe that the objects of perception which confront them, such as an individual animal or a single star, are independent and permanent existences, compared with which thoughts are unsubstantial and dependent on something else. In fact, however, the perceptions of sense are the properly dependent and secondary feature, while the thoughts are really independent and primary. This being so, Kant gave the title of objective to the intellectual factor, to the universal and necessary. He was quite justified in doing so. Our sensations, on the other hand, are subjective, for sensations lack stability in their own nature, and are no less fleeting and evanescent than thought is permanent and self-subsisting. At the present day, the special line of distinction established by Kant between the subjective and objective is adopted by the phraseology of the educated world. Thus, the criticism of a work of art ought, it is said, to not be subjective, but objective. In other words, instead of springing from the particular and accidental feeling or temper of the moment, it should keep its eye on the general points of view which the laws of art establish. In the same acceptation, we can distinguish in any scientific pursuit the objective and subjective interest of the investigation. But after all, objectivity of thought in Kant's sense is again to a certain extent subjective. Thoughts according to Kant, although universal and necessary categories, are only our thoughts, separated by an impassable gulf from the thing, as it exists apart from our knowledge. But the true objectivity of thinking means that thoughts, far from being merely ours, must at the same time be the real essence of things, and of whatever is an object to us. Objective and subjective are convenient expressions in current use, the employment of which may easily lead to confusion. Up to this point, the discussion has shown three meanings of objectivity. First, it means what has an external existence, in distinction from which the subjective is what is only supposed, dreamed, etc. Secondly, it is the meaning attached to it by Kant, that the universal and necessary, as distinguished from the particular, subjective and occasional element which belongs to our sensation. Thirdly, it has been just explained, it means thought apprehended essence of the existing thing, in contradistinction from what is merely our thought, and what consequently is still separated from the thing itself, as it exists in independent essence. End of Part 1 of Chapter 4, recorded by Ryan Smallwood.